We're also joined right now by Jonathan Ruhe, who's Director of Foreign Policy, Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Welcome to both of you. The economic pressure, and Mills is hitting on some of this. Matthew, I can start with you on this, is kind of a key moment in President Trump's decision-making, it seems like, in the war effort. When oil shot up yesterday, the president comes out and then says, all right, this war is going to be over sooner rather than later. I know the Wall Street Journal is reporting this morning to suggest his political advisors might be urging him to find an off-ramp. How do you see it kind of taking shape if there is an off-ramp?
There may well be. We could pull back at some point. It's a little unclear with the mixed messages that we're hearing. The challenge is that we're essentially in a worse position in terms of leadership in Iran now. And so the real question going forward is, if the previous Ayatollah has been replaced by someone who's more radical, closer to the military, it may be even more unpredictable in terms of what happens going forward with attacks on some of the neighbors over there. So I think it's just really hard to tell, even if we pull back, what really changes, and does the Strait of Hormuz become fully open again, or doesn't it? It's very hard to tell right now where this is all headed.
It is. Even here in the region, it's hard to tell, because yesterday we thought that we had this story kind of developing, Jonathan, where things were slowing down. And they might be, like I said a moment ago. We'll see what the data shows. But it feels like today's a little bit different. We had alerts here in Dubai. They just had this fire reported in Abu Dhabi. And to the point that Matthew is making, if all of this leaves the regime in power, weakened, but with maybe a harder line figure than his father leading it, will it all have been worth it?
So I think that's sort of the crux of the dilemma that Trump faces right now. Is the Iranian regime is sending every signal it can, both in terms of appointing a new successor to Khamenei, but also in how it's behaving around the region, continuing to threaten the pre-war economic calm of a lot of the Gulf states and Hormuz in particular. The regime is saying to President Trump, we see you searching for off-ramps within your administration. We see you hesitating. Message received. We will do everything we can to signal to you and the world, including the global economy, that we can ride this out longer than you can. We're willing to pay any price at this point, and our risk acceptance is greater than your ability to watch prices at the pump continue to rise. So, yes, you, President Trump, should probably think about ending this war sooner rather than later.
And Trump may have bought himself, Matthew, a little bit of time with those comments yesterday in terms of oil prices, but that wouldn't last necessarily very long if indeed we do see things ratcheting up again here. So if you had kind of a list of options that are the best ones for the president right now, given where we are, what do you think they are?
Well, I've said this multiple times. Right now, the biggest beneficiary of this war is Russia, in that they're being allowed to actually sell more oil to other countries without sanctions. And I think this is really the most destabilizing adversary we have is Russia. I would pivot back to getting those missile interceptors back into Ukraine's hands, really start weighing in and ejecting Russia from Ukraine. That will have a much broader stability going forward. But in terms of this situation in Iran, it's hard to say. I think pulling back could make some sense, but to Jonathan's point, it could also look like a victory for Iran, and that would just embolden them going forward, and that's not a good situation at all either.
And how would Israel, Jonathan, look at that?
So it's interesting. This is, certainly negatively for the Israelis, who tend to always think in terms of decisive, if also short-term operational goals. We, the Israelis, would say want to set back Iran's nuclear program by several years, delay their missile program by several years. This war is very unique in Israel's history, because it's a war where their explicit goal is to overthrow the regime, or create the conditions for its collapse internally by eradicating its military power. And, to your previous question of whether this would all be for naught, sort of at this point, given these initial goals that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out, basically stopping halfway at this point would be very difficult, because for all the reasons we've discussed, you'd have an Iranian regime that ends the war thinking, well, we survived the worst that our two biggest enemies could throw at us, and so now we'll double down on all the aggressive behavior that we've learned is the way to keep our regime alive.
All right, Jonathan and Matthew, we thank you both.